Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Stacy Fox. I'm with the Market Intelligence team at Open Minds. Today, as part of our weekly Circle Elite Roundtable series, Open Minds Senior Associate Paul Duck and Centerstone CEO David Guth will present our topic today of getting your executives ready for up to speed for MA&A. Sorry about that, guys. Paul Duck brings over 25 years of leadership and management experience, focusing on managed care, health information technology organization, strategy, business development, and market expansion, as well as customer experience optimization to the Open Minds team. Mr. Guth is both CEO and co-founder of Centerstone, one of our nation's largest behavioral health providers, serving nearly 180,000 individuals. With over 43 years of behavioral health experience, 36 years in executive leadership comprising both business and clinical expertise. Before we get started, I have a couple of brief housekeeping reminders. Your audio will be muted during today's briefing, but we do want to hear any questions you may have. Please feel free to submit those in the question box on the right side of your screen, and we will present them at the end. Also, the slides and recording from today's briefing will be available on the Open Minds website tomorrow. So let's get started. Paul, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stacy. Appreciate it very much. And good afternoon, everyone. We're thrilled to be here today, and thank you for attending. This is a topic in an area where I'm fortunate to have one of the, I think, our industry's biggest experts in mergers, acquisitions, and affiliations, having actually gone through this with Centerstone and David Guth, my co-presenter today, really in talking about not only the process and how important that is, that that you understand that there is a process for not-for-profit organizations to affiliate in a way that really kind of continues to hold the community value for the organization and all of the other things that are kind of wrapped into the purpose of not-for-profit organizations and the great work that gets done. And we'll actually go through a case study on some of the lessons that were learned from Manatee Glens, which is now Centerstone of Florida. I happened to be the board chair at the time, and there was a lot of great learning that took place within the bounds of board of directors, and a lot of those kind of lessons learned I want to share with you today. And obviously sharing the Centerstone perspective on affiliation. David is certainly the right guy to do that. So with that, those are kind of our overview in terms of what we're going to kind of accomplish today. As I said a few moments ago, David Guth is a personal friend, but also literally an industry expert at affiliations, mergers, and acquisitions. So David, will you take it over and kind of give us some general concepts of your perspectives?
Thank you, Paul, and it's great. It's great to be doing this with you. And Paul talked a lot about the lessons that he learned going through this process. And I will tell you, having done many of these, I learned some things from Paul that we'll talk about later that have now become part of the standard process that I use as well. So it's great to be doing this with you, and I welcome everybody. I always, when I'm talking to folks about this, we always start with the idea that all of this really is propelled by your strategic planning. And the organizations that I've seen that have had the most success in this area are ones that have really had their boards engaged in strategic planning. And in doing that, your plan starts with, what are the objectives? What's the market telling you as you've done your analysis of strengths and weaknesses in your organization? What do you need to do? What are your objectives? And those objectives then can lead you to one of your strategies in accomplishing that is growth. So understanding what you need from growth, what is it you're trying to accomplish, is really important. You never just grow just to grow, and you don't just jump to affiliation as growth without understanding why that is, in that particular case, the most advantageous way to accomplish the necessary scale. So start off with that. And then also think about how much growth do you need to support those objectives, and by when. And be realistic as you. I'll show you in a minute. Next slide. In fact, we can just go on to that, Paul, if you don't mind. I use this with both our organization and other organizations to think about, as you've got your objectives in front of you and you're thinking about the amount of growth, the areas of growth that you need, and by when, then you look at what all the options are. And the reason for that is everybody wants to grow by acquiring smaller organizations, right? I mean, that's, or to do a joint venture or a partnership. And the reason is that feels the most comfortable. It feels like that involves the least sort of lack of control and so forth. So I get that, but sometimes I'll see organizations heading down a path that will not give them the growth that they've already declared they need. And so I always say it's worth the discipline of, as you go through your strategic planning, at least contemplating what all the different options are. And then as you either select an opportunity or approach by an opportunity, think about where that fits in. And so again, with these strategies or these tactics for growth, think about how likely they are to get you to where you need by when you need it. All right, so we'll go on to the next slide.
So David, again, thank you for that. To me, I think there's so many great reasons why organizations should or shouldn't consider affiliation. And I think, you certainly have are, again, the author of a very important book, which, again, I would encourage our audience, if you're interested in this topic. And I know, David, you're going to take some of the things that you wrote about in your book, Strategic Unions, which is really kind of the formula for these affiliations. But again, if you haven't purchased this book, it is available on Amazon and other websites as well, wherever you buy books. But it's a really great primer on the kind of steps you should be taking. But David, would you take us through kind of at high level what some of those steps are?
Yeah, Paul, thank you, and thanks for the endorsement here. I'll just say I've learned a lot of this through the series of sort of hard knocks. These are hard-won lessons, and happy to share those with folks. Listen, particularly in the nonprofit space, it really helps to think about this whole process much like the dating and marriage, and that's really the metaphor that I use. In the for-profit world where you're buying one organization, it very much is like purchasing an asset. But in the nonprofit world, it really is more like dating and marriage. So basic stages, I'll go through more detail in just a minute, but the basic stages, your dating stage, you got a non-disclosure agreement, you're doing preliminary exploration, just some basic due diligence, looking at what's publicly available. Once you've done the non-disclosure, sharing financial statements and so forth. But that's when you're just exploring, and you might be in an exploratory phase with one or more organizations during this phase. The next stage is going steady. You've now got some very clear timeframes for this exploration. The boards are involved. You now have a letter of interest. Letter of interest, the reason the letter of interest is important is it lays out a time frame and mutual expectations for the exploration. And you also establish a task force, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Stage 3, you've now got a plan together. The task force has worked with the leadership. The boards are all up to speed. And you are now in the engage phase. The letter of intent is the engagement. It's non-binding, but I always tell folks it's the most important step in this process, because to back out after a letter of engagement without having some really breaking news that wasn't knowable at the time, it really creates a bad faith experience. It can often create a public relations nightmare and so forth. And it's also meant that you've wasted a lot of time and effort. So even though when the boards vote on a letter of intent, they know it's non-binding, there is an ethical obligation to say, we're making a good faith commitment that barring something coming up in the public phase of this, we intend to move forward. And included in that is the final stage. You're going to your payers, you're going to your regulators, you're dealing with anybody on the outside that's not been part of the discussion that could raise an objection or could cause you to come back and alter the plan in some way. So that's the engagement period, and then the marriage is sort of it ends up being the final stage of that ends up being kind of a nothing event, a bunch with some attorneys, but the real work begins. And I can't stress that enough, Paul, when you know this, when it's like marriage, you think that the wedding is the big deal. You haven't been married. So anyway, so let's see where we go from there. So just to go through these steps a little bit, all of this process is designed to make sure that you don't outrun the board, and that you deal with early on, you deal with understandings, mutual agreements around the toughest issues first. The tendency, without this discipline, the tendency is to go to the easy stuff or to push aside and wait for later the tough issues. My experience is that is always a problem, because those tough issues don't get easier with time. And what you end up doing is spending a lot of time and effort and resources on something that's not going to happen. If it's not going to happen, find that out quickly. There are 3 outcomes that come from these discussions: a decision to move forward and do this, a decision to stop and not do that, or a process that lingers and lingers and lingers. Those first 2 options are good options. The third one is not. You don't have the bandwidth, and neither does the other organization, to just be in a constant dance around this. So get those tough issues out early. Make sure your board's involved. The tough issues are really, it gets down to brand, corporate structure, who's going to be the CEO, leadership, and really board structure, how you're organizing your board, and so forth. There are other things that practically speaking are really big, but generally not as much of a deal breaker as these other issues. What systems are you going to use? What software platforms, so forth. Those end up not being deal breakers, but these other issues do. Let's move to the next one. So the task force, I always say you can use any members of the task force, any number that you want, as long as it's 3 per organization. So, and the reason for that is you want the task force to be relatively small, but you want each board to have 3 members so that you don't end up with a disagreement and nobody can kind of convince one or the other members to change their posture. The task force is not meant to do this in a vacuum of the other board. Task force takes the CEO out of the role of having to either sell this to the board or whatever else. The task force members are keeping the full board aware. It's their responsibility to do that. They're bringing issues forward. I'll mention this. I recommend in this phase that people use the Paul Duck method. Paul did with his board, he'll talk a little bit about it in a minute, is when he started the process with Manatee Glens, he said to the full board, every one of you, I want you to raise questions and concerns. We're going to keep a running documentation of that. And before you're asked to vote, we will have every one of those issues addressed. Doesn't mean that everything gets addressed to everybody's satisfaction, but that allowed his board to relax and think about all the other things rather than being hung up on maybe 1 or 2 questions that they wanted to make sure that didn't get forgotten. So I know, Paul, you'll say more about that. But the task force at this phase is working with management. Management's bringing in various levels of plans. The task force is vetting it to see if they can support it. And then they go back to their boards, get the endorsement, so that they're the ones that if you get down to the altar and you've got board members that are saying, well, I don't like what we decided to do about the brand. Those are the board members that turn to them and say, we had a straw vote on this back, yada, yada, yada. We agreed to this. You sat in this room and agreed to this. And we're at the final hour. Don't tell us that we spent all this time and effort and now this is going to be an issue. That ship has passed. CEO does not need to be in the role of saying that. Task force members do. So, and the reality is that with the 3 task force members back and forth with the board. I've never seen that then result in a board at the final hour having members pull back. With Centerstone, I will tell you, with all the affiliations we've done, all the ones that moved forward had unanimous votes from all the boards. So that kind of tells you how the process works. And then at the end, it is the task force, not the CEO, that goes to the respective boards and says, okay, task force has agreement. You all have seen the plan as it's come out. We've now got the full plan that you've had, and we are recommending that you approve the letter of intent. And though it is not binding, this is the most important vote you're going to make, because this triggers the public announcement of our intent to marry, right? And you don't leave brides or grooms at the altar. The most important decision occurs at the time you put the ring on the finger. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, if you will. So step 7, the respective boards approve the letter of intent. Again, if you've done the work right up until this time, follow those steps, then this ends up being a celebratory vote. It's not uncommon to have, a celebration party associated with this and so forth. And then the CEOs are authorized at that point to execute the letter of intent. And then it is at that point that you execute all these steps in step 9, where you cascade your communications to your key stakeholders, to your staff leadership that have not been in the loop, to your board leadership, to donors, to whatever. But you go to your regulators and key payers and you say, we're coming to you early on. We want to talk to you about this. It's not a done deal. We've got a plan, though. We didn't want to come and talk to you with just a pie in the sky. We wanted to make sure we had a detailed plan to discuss with you. And our experience is the regulators love that. They love hearing about it from you first before your cascading communication has hit the papers and so forth. Now, that can all be pretty quick, within 24 hours for us usually, but they hear about it directly from you. You're asking for the invitation to come and talk to them about it, and we found that works really well. And they're not like, okay, you did this without our input or whatever. No, it's just, we're bringing a plan to you. And that's really when you do the public phase of due diligence. There's some things you just literally cannot do in the quiet phase, and that's the final phase. But I always tell folks, anything that's knowable needs to be known before you get to this phase. We actually walked away at almost to the altar with one where things were disclosed way too late that were knowable, and they were just holding back from us. And we share everything we know in the early phases as the NDA is signed, so there's just no surprises. We've all got warts and wrinkles, but let your proposed partner know about that early on. Again, then you do the final due diligence. The boards approve the final transaction, which is the binding vote. But again, that ends up being sort of a nothing. Again, that can be the time when you have a celebratory party, but that ends up not being a big deal. And then the real deal happens when the CEOs execute the closing documents, and that's a meeting in the attorney's board conference room where you all run around and sign all the documents. After that, after it's all been signed, that's when you do the branding and communication. Not the plan for that. The plan has already been approved. This is when you actually begin changing out signs and letterhead and business cards, which seem silly at this point in time, given how we all operate. And then the real work begins as the affiliation goes live. So let's see.
David, that was really kind of a spectacular overview, and it's very reminiscent of my experience in going through. And it was, to me, such a perfect formulation of process and planning. The pieces around communication, how you're going to communicate to which constituent, and for that to happen in a very rapid fashion, but in an orderly fashion, really was just phenomenally important. And I think, this, again, I'm a big fan of the process that you just spoke about, but I also want to talk a little bit about Manatee Glen's as an organization, and having been the board chair and seeing the moving pieces underneath it. And this may certainly sound familiar to some of you attending this webinar today or watching it after the fact. Because again, I think especially for CEOs, the board dynamics are very interesting to say the least. But one of the characteristics of not-for-profit boards, and Manatee Glen's board was no different. It was a bunch of community leaders in very prominent roles, but very few had any understanding of healthcare or behavioral healthcare, frankly. But they cared very much about the mission. So that's the reason why they were so deeply engaged. I think it's important to note, and I just see so many organizations making a mistake by really kind of their boards becoming overly involved. But really, I just want to lay the framework for this, because we actually spent a lot of time when I became the board chair of really kind of defining and reminding people of what the board's responsibilities and duties were. And again, it's all the simple stuff, but it is prescribed very clearly in terms of what the responsibilities of boards are. So it's ensuring legal and ethical conduct. It's recruiting a CEO if we need one, or a succession planning, or deciding on major investments and corporate strategy. All of those are important, but one of the things that's really important is that a board's role is never to meddle in operations. Realistically, the board has one employee, the CEO. From that standpoint, but they are not, there's no invitation for any board member to meddle in operations. And when I say meddle, I'm talking about you're holding the CEO responsible for the performance of the organization. You're not supposed to be in, meeting with at the director level, wondering what they do on a daily basis. This is not the role of the board. And I think it's important, again, for that framework to be in place for you to even successfully talk about affiliation, because the process itself is critically important. And if it's not followed to a T, I think there's a lot of things that kind of fall through. Real basically, the fiduciary responsibilities of a board member is a duty of loyalty and duty of care. It's really the only two responsibilities a board member has. And again, this is really about taking care of an organization financially, using good judgment, not having any conflicts of interest. All of these things become super critical. And if one of these happens during the tenure of a board member, they should resign or be moved off of any board, especially a not-for-profit board. These responsibilities are super critical. But again, no, none of these imply being involved in operating the organization. None of these two fiduciary responsibilities have anything to do with operating the company. So I want to talk about Manatee Glen's. So this is an organization located in Bradenton, Florida, just south of the Tampa Bay area. And Manatee Glen's had been in business for about 60 years and serves about 16,000 clients each year for both mental health, addictions, child abuse, neglect, and adoption. So, pretty broad perspective organization, outpatient, partial hospitalization, and it had an inpatient hospital, which was a new feature when you consider the Centerstone world. It was the first hospital consideration for their system as well. So they were, looking for that experience. We had 13 board members, and one of the things that I insisted upon when I became the board chair, and I convinced the board it was a good idea, is to actually have somebody who had a national perspective, specifically in behavioral health. And we actually did move that person onto the board about a year before our discussions began about affiliation. But I think it's important to have a couple of people. If you have a board that has 13-ish board members, which I think is probably a decent number, it's important to have a couple of people that really do understand the industry and have some kind of market intelligence or idea about some of the shifting dynamics, especially as we now are in a very rapid shift as an industry. If basically it was about a $30 million top line budget organization with an inpatient hospital, as I said a moment ago. And again, the board makeup was not unlike most other not-for-profit boards. It had some very, very long-standing board members. There were no term limits. So we had board members that had decades of experience on this board, and obviously the organization itself was almost like a child to them in many ways. So we had reached a point in 2015 where the CEO and the board really had a discussion about all the changes. This is post Affordable Care Act and a lot of the dynamic changes that were going on around value-based payment. And we kind of saw on the horizon a need to become a larger organization. So we really kind of laid out two options. One was to affiliate with another larger Florida provider organization that already understood the market. They understood ACA, they understood the Florida dynamics, or to affiliate with a national organization. So we began kind of a really kind of high level search and some very, very basic discussions with organizations. And I think, you know, that's really what kind of led us to Centerstone. Both the CEO, Mary Ruiz at the time, and myself had both known David for quite some time. And we invited David to come in and just literally just talk about affiliation because he had already been through the process. And it was really to educate the board more than anything else. And obviously what happened was it became, hey, this organization sounds a lot like ours. Here are some key steps, I think, in the process, just from a board management perspective. And so this is kind of for board members, chairs of boards, and also for the CEOs that are in attendance here. First thing is to create an affiliation committee. As David pointed out, your task force is really, really critical. You do not want your entire board involved in all of the details. It just, the process itself, and that's the reason why David insisted. He said the number that you want is up to 3 and only 3, and I think that's probably absolutely accurate. And I think one of the things that's important is that you want the people that have the most influence, the people that have been on the board for decades, the people that have high visibility within the board members and have the respect of the other board members, where what they say, whether they're the board chair or not, really does have a huge impact in terms of how people think. So you put them on the committee. So in other words, bring them and make them part of the process because you want them to help you carry the message back to the full board. And again, you have to have that regular communication of the affiliation committee with the entire board on a very regular basis. Most not-for-profit boards meet once a month. We actually met probably every week or bi-weekly at one point, just to kind of bring people up to speed, because the dynamics and the changes that were being considered and the things that we were discovering, and we wanted to make sure that this remained top of mind with the entire board, but also to keep the process moving. Make certain that the courtship phase is that you get every question. David mentioned this, but you know, I was incredibly insistent that there was not one board member that was going to sandbag and basically hold off to the end and say, well, we never talked about this really important issue and why we need to get this issue. We wanted to get them all out front. We exchanged lists between the two organizations, and literally we scripted answers for every single question, and as did Centerstone for Manatee Glens. Every question was answered. If there were follow-up questions, those got answered, but every board member had every question answered. It was documented and distributed incredibly regularly. Again, you encourage and ask the influencers to be vocal, especially at board meetings. You want them to say what is on their mind. And obviously you want to make sure that all of their questions have been answered and that they are a supporter in the process, if they should be a supporter. Obviously, if the affiliation is not something, if there's been things that have been disclosed that aren't necessarily in favor of your organization, you know, they should be saying that as well. But again, you want to make sure that they're close to the process. You take the votes back to the full board as the courtship becomes more serious, and gain full board support for each phase. Really critical, again, is that you have a regular process of voting so that you know as you move through the different steps that David outlined, that you actually have approval, full approval. So the next step of approval is scripted, it's known, all of the information has been presented, and again, there's no holes for leakage in terms of the decision-making process. It doesn't come down to one person's opinion. It really is a collective decision process. And then you arrange to have your board meet with the other organization's board, and David is prescribed this in the beginning. And I think it's really important because as you enter the letter of intent phase, where you're basically making the commitment to move forward, to understand and be able to look people in the eyes. And of course, we're now in the COVID era, we'll call it. But nevertheless, it's, I think, a very important process to actually go through the process of having the boards physically meet. And that really I think provided Manatee Glens a tremendous amount of comfort that the other organization's board cared as deeply about as all the people that we met from Centerstone, and David certainly was a key reason for that. But we entered the letter of intent phase having met their board, so there was really any additional conversations that needed to take place. We're able to do so at that point. So again, I think the kind of the Paul's list of the things to pay attention to the most, you have to make sure, especially if you're the board chair, you have to make sure that you're communicating very regularly with the CEO, that you remain on the same page. I love what David said about really taking the CEO's role of being the mother of this project, of the affiliation project, and really allowing the board to work through that. And really, that's why the board chair and the CEO have to stay in lockstep, so that they're able to manage the process. Because remember, the CEO has got to manage and think about all of the staff that are going to be impacted by this as well. So that communication becomes very important. You have to keep the process moving. Again, I don't think you want any large gaps in time between meetings and discussions. You want to make sure that the affiliation committee is reporting back on a very regular basis, that the board is meeting regularly, that there are conversations that happen regularly, so that your process doesn't slow down, because slowing down is death. You never want something to linger on or be protracted. You have to communicate with the influencers, the people that have the experience, the people that have the attention of the other board members. You want to make sure that you're communicating as the board chair, especially one-on-one. You call them on the phone. You're meeting, having lunch with them, and talking them through the process. You're making sure that they are on board, because those influencers are incredibly important and their opinions are important. They may actually, see some things that you've maybe turned a blind eye to. So, but it's important that they feel, whether they are on the affiliation committee or not, that they feel like they have that one-on-one communication. And it's really I think, a display of respect as well. To, again, make sure that you're addressing every single question, and make sure you put it in writing and you distribute it continuously. It's really important that you do this. And I think always, the thing that I've always encouraged the board at the time when we were going through this is that this is not about you. This is about an organization. It's not about a person's job. It's not about anything other than what is best for this organization. And we went through the process up front to determine why it was that this was a good idea, and why it was that we were moving forward. Again, it was wonderful to move through it with Centerstone and David having really kind of already, again, scripted and had a formula for it. But again, there was so much great learning that took place in the process, and it was great to hear David say that there hasn't been one affiliation that Centerstone has gone through that he didn't learn something from, and it has refined further. Probably you're ready for a second or third edition of your book, David, at this point, I would imagine. So if you kind of take us now maybe through the Centerstone perspective, which I think is important for people to understand contextually as we went through this process.
Sure, and I appreciate that. Paul, a couple of things that you mentioned, that if I were to do a revision on the book, one of the things that I'd recommend is and it's something that you alluded to, if you are geographically proximate enough to do this, getting the boards together as a full board, even early, like right at the time you sign the letter of interest. Remember the going steady, you're forming the task force. And we did this, I did this with a group that I was consulting with a couple of years ago. There were actually 4 organizations that ultimately came together, but they were all physically proximate enough that they could get the boards together for a meeting and a dinner together. One of my board members, actually from Kentucky, said, as we went through the process up there, said, familiarity builds trust, and for boards, a lot of this is trust.
It is.
And the more time they spend with board members from the other organization, the more they realize these are people that are wired, may come from different walks of life, different industries, all that, but they're really wired around the mission, and that goes a long way. So, and again, I recommend the Paul Duck method. That keeping that running list of questions and issues is really terrific, and I've used that Paul Duck method in everyone that I've consulted with or worked with since then. Well, just a little bit about Centerstone. Again, when we were approached by Manatee Glens, by the CEO, You know, so, but we already knew that we were looking for out-of-state affiliates a certain size. We knew that we were not nearly at the scale we need to be. And I'll say that today we are not at the scale we need to be, not because of some magic number on scale, but because there are objectives that we need to accomplish that we cannot accomplish at our current scale, and that's $300 million in revenue. So, you know, if you're less than 300 million, I'm going to suggest to you that there are things, objectives that still need to be in front of you that are going to be reliant on scale. So anyway, just a little bit about us. Our noble purpose, we had these 19 different mission statements. We went through a process of identifying really what was the common noble purpose behind all of us, and that's delivering care that changes people's lives. Our values, as we've uncovered them, really are respect, expertise, integrity, and empowerment. And I suspect that this all is very similar to what stands underneath as the foundation of each of your organizations. Centerstone at a high level, we got about 24 different service lines. Paul mentioned that the hospital is our only hospital today. We hope someday to have multiple hospitals, but that's one service line. We have 24 of those. You know, right now we're going through the same staffing challenges I think most of you are. That 3,800 is about 3,650 right now. So we're actively hiring. And we were serving about 108,000. We're really right now just a little over 140,000 individuals. And we'll serve almost 3,000 services, provide almost 3,000 services each year. Interestingly enough, in the first 16 months of COVID, we delivered over 2 million telehealth services. So I don't know what that number is today, but it took us about I guess 16 months to get to 2 million. You know, our history at Centerstone is our collective history. It's our family tree, and we've learned that we embrace and support and hold up the family tree history, not the line of one particular affiliate or another. This was really a marriage. And I don't know about you, but when I married my wife, we brought our family histories together, our families together. It wasn't one family or one side. It was all of that. So this is the Centerstone history. And you can kind of see how all the organizations and when they came together. All right, let's see. Let's take us to the next slide. So I think that gets us to Q&A,
yeah,
Paul.
it does. I mean, in David, I know you and I have, again, obviously spoken ad nauseum about this topic, and really, I so appreciate your wisdom, your phenomenal humbleness about the topic itself, and I think both of us remain students of the process itself, and are humbled by the opportunity to serve people. So I think that's what is kind of a common denominator. And when you find that, to your point about the boards meeting, is that, you know, this is, even though people tend to paint a picture of we're being acquired or we may be affiliating and or dating the wrong people, having those boards meet really changes everything. It changes the way people think about the other organization. And again, I think as we went through this process with Centerstone, with Manatee Glens, the reality is that even everyone loved David Guth, but was like, what about the rest of the organization and what it represents? And you know, is everybody like that? And is the leadership like that? And that's when I think when the boards met, it was one of those marker moments where you knew everything was kind of a right fit, irrespective of any financial due diligence, et cetera. As long as those things lined up at that point, I think everybody on both sides were really on board. So Stacy, I don't know whether we have any questions that have come in. If you do have any questions, if you click on the questions box and type those in, we will get them and be happy to answer. Do we have any questions, Stacy?
I have a few questions that we can use as follow-up here that have come through. You provided a lot of information, and you know, as you've said throughout, the importance of really having that board engagement is so critical. Do you have any advice for a CEO who has a board that is unwilling to explore an affiliation?
Oh, David, I'm gonna toss this one to you. This is you probably have seen this one before.
Yeah, it's a couple things I want to say on that. One is you don't outrun your board, and it's important to recognize this early on. Um, a couple of fine points about this. Um, the more you expose your board and have conversations with your board in your strategic planning about the notion of affiliations, because what happens typically is there is an opportunity that emerges, right? That you can't always predict when, well, you can never really predict when both parties to an affiliation are going to be coming to the table to talk. There's things, strategies you can approach, but the fact is, the more conversation you have with your board, the better. And if your board is not prepared to move to even explore it, then don't waste your time. But there's some ways in which you can kind of help salt the mine, if you will. And one is, again, exposing your board, bringing them to conferences that mergers or affiliations are going to be discussed. Give them access, encouraging them to watch this this webcast. I know that's being made available to you all. I don't want to promote the book. I don't make any money off of it. But I think that I wrote that book really for board members, so that the CEOs could distribute that to their boards and help them kind of get comfortable with how this process works and what it's not about. So I would encourage you all to, if you're thinking about this, don't outrun your boards. Give your boards an opportunity to really talk about this and think about this collectively before they're having to deal with a specific that gets a little scarier, right?
Yeah, and I think, it's important to have an understanding and an agreement with the board about why you're going to be doing this. In other words, you don't have a research institute, and you know that research is going to become incredibly important as a value add in local, in community stature, in your understanding about how to best push forward best practice and treatment, et cetera. There's so many reasons, but outlining those, I think, are really important. And I think that's where, a lot of CEOs and boards become disconnected, is not having a full understanding of what's going on as an industry, because again, the change going on in health and human services is profound. And so if affiliation is going to be part of a thought process, understanding this about why.
And Paul, again, channeling something that you've done, please make a distinction between a board that is unwilling to talk about it and one that is skeptical, right? So you have got some wonderful skeptics on your board. I'm talking to the audience here. I certainly do. And I've learned to rely on them. And Paul alluded to this earlier. Oftentimes your most skeptical board members are ones that everybody else looks to make sure that the air is sweet. Those folks are smiling and nodding. So I always encourage organizations to put their skeptics on that task force, because they're going to ask the tough questions, and they need to ask the tough questions. Right. And the more intimate they are in the process, the more they get to air all the questions and issues and be part of the discussion, as well as starting to build a relationship with their counterparts from the other board. So Paul, I know you did this, that it really resulted in a very deep exploration, which in the end was beneficial to the affiliation. And those individuals came back and were going, we need to do this. And when you got your skeptics on the board that are really seen as not only the thought leaders, but the skeptics who are coming back going, there's no question, this is a good thing, we need to do it. Your board there's just this collective sigh and embrace of this opportunity. So
very true.
And well done.
Stacy, any others?
I was going to say, kind of following along, in addition to the challenge of making sure that your board is on board, what aspects of an affiliation otherwise do you see as the biggest challenges, and how would you mitigate some of those challenges?
Yeah,
several of these. Feel free.
Yeah, I didn't mean to step over here, Paul, but I have to smile, because on the first round of them, I can tell you the biggest challenge we had, and that was my arrogance. You talk about my humility. I've earned it the hard way. I was involved early on in some affiliations where I was by far the biggest organization coming to the table, and we were doing a multiple affiliation that literally doubled the size of what my previous organization was, and I thought I knew how to do that. I thought I knew that this was going to be just about doing the same things we did, but at a bigger scale. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. When we did our first multi-state, there was still a little of that. It was still a little like, well, now this is okay. So we've learned the humility about, that scale makes a difference, and it's not everything the same. But this can't be that much different than the growth that we've done inside the state. Oh my goodness, it was.
Yeah.
So I'd say the biggest obstacle has been, certainly inside the Centerstone system was my own arrogance. I'm a much more humble person than I was, 20 years ago, whenever it was that we started doing this.
Experience has played a big role. So I know you've been through a number of these very successfully, and I think it's important to note is that not every Centerstone, every time you've looked at an affiliation, I mean, your organization has walked away. I know that firsthand.
Well, we have, and also, we've had our first divorce, if you will. We had an affiliation that we did end up mutually agreeing to unwind, and great organization. In the end, we just had different objectives for both what the affiliation would bring and what the what the future really looked like and how we need to position ourselves. I will say marriages are a whole lot more fun than divorces. And I think that, but we also learn through those as well. So, and here's the other thing. I always say, I've yet to meet a person that doesn't love change as long as it doesn't involve them. Right? And here's the deal. Oftentimes the sort of the surviving CEO, if you will, the one that emerges as the CEO of an affiliation or merger, is the one that's going, gosh, I do understand all the changes that everybody else is going through, without realizing all the changes that happen in that role, particularly if you're gaining significant scale. If the decisions that I no longer am involved in, that I was when I was operating even a $30 million organization. Oh my goodness, the differences, and lots of good reasons that we don't have to go into all today. But you're building expertise as you grow to scale, expertise that you don't have. And if all I'm doing is getting bigger, and I'm not using this as an opportunity to get some people with deeper expertise in the organization that ought to be making decisions that I should not be making anymore, then what am I doing, right? So I say, the hard work happens afterwards, and humility surviving CEO, because the person that has to change the most in all of this is you.
Yeah. So. Very good point. That's an outstanding point, David. Well said.
Any other comments on that topic before we move on to a few other questions we have?
Nope, let's move on.
All right. So you mentioned a few times too during the presentation that this is not a forever process. How long start to finish should an affiliation take, and is there a way to accelerate that process should it start to slow down?
Well, David, I know that when we undertook the Manatee Glen Centerstone affiliation, I think we had originally set out a 12-month kind of timetable to say this can't take any longer than 12 months, otherwise, it will linger on and die. I don't know whether you've got any additional kind of thoughts or refinement of that process.
So it is somewhat. You have to be realistic in terms of some of the factors that play into this, and whether you're talking about the private phase, the phase leading up to the letter of intent, or the phase going beyond that. But physical proximity is a big issue. Now think about this. When Centerstone was affiliating with Manatee Glen's headquartered in Bradenton, Florida, Centerstone headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee, We had board members that were on the task force coming from 3 different states going to Florida or vice versa. And we were not nearly as facile about the kind of format that we're working in here. This was all face-to-face. So there was going to be a longer process. And also because of a hospital and some nuances, we knew it was going to take some time to navigate the post-public phase of this. Having said that, generally, if you're physically proximate where you can bring folks together, I'd say get the private phase done within 90 days. Carve out the time, get that done. And the public phase can go quickly. I've seen it go as quick as a month. I've seen it take more than 6 months simply because there were regulatory approvals that had to happen that just took some time. Right. So, but to Paul's point, you wouldn't want from start to finish this to be more than a year. For one thing, until it's a final deal, there is still a lot of distraction on this. And yes, there's a lot, the real work happens post-affiliation, but remember, until you know what's going to happen, all the work and effort that's going into it is speculative at some level.
Right.
And you only have so much bandwidth on that. So, and the other is, look, I talk about this in the book. Everybody goes through a bit of the grieving cycle. And anybody that tells you they're not is lying to themselves. I don't think they're lying to you, but they're lying to themselves. And the grieving cycle is, I mean, the first thing is, this is great. It's just denial. It's like nothing's changed. This is great. And you want as much of the grieving cycle is real in the sense that people have to go through it. But, you're going to end up with some folks going through the anger phase just because that's what happens. They're angry that things aren't working the way they used to. They're angry they don't have the same relationships that they used to. They're angry because it's hard. And, you want that to happen after the ink is dry, honestly, because it is going to happen. And you want to be able to put your attention on that, but not have any of that end up disrupting it. By the way, with the boards, that grieving generally occurs before. I got to tell you, the boards get this and embrace it and get excited about it and stay excited about it really deeper and faster than any of your other layers of management do. Yeah. So just a little heads up on that.
Very good point. Stacy, any others?
All right, just a couple of more if we have time. We definitely have time for one more, and we'll see if we have time for any others. What are the top reasons why organizations would not want to affiliate in today's market?
Oh boy, that's a question I think certainly, David, you got a tremendous amount of firsthand knowledge of, but I have to imagine financial stability's got to be one of those. Is that you don't want to be looking to acquire something that would potentially be a financial drain on your organization. In other words, have this magical attitude that we're smarter, so therefore we can fix it, and probably vice versa, is that you want to affiliate because you're financially desperate. I think that's another probably common reason why people should not be looking to go through that process, because again, part of it is that if you have financial issues to begin with, it's an expensive process to go through affiliation, so that will actually compound your problem of financial crisis. And David, please feel free to add.
You're right on all those elements, Paul. People that know me know I like to use maritime metaphors, even though I've never actually owned a boat. So, in full disclosure, if sinking ships, it's not a good idea to tie them off to other sinking ships. That doesn't help. And so there are companies out there that acquire troubled assets, that have a whole system for taking on troubled assets. If your organization is a troubled asset, and listen, if your bottom line is not in the black, and you couldn't go out and extend or borrow a lot of money given your current financial performance, you're a troubled asset. You can move out of that, but at this time you're a troubled asset. If your balance sheet is scary thin, you're a troubled asset. So there are organizations that will acquire those and are geared to do that. But in the world of most of the organizations that we've affiliated with have not been troubled assets. Not saying that they haven't had challenges, not saying that, every year is in the black. Every organization in our space has had some ups and downs, but it's best to approach organizations when you're in a healthy situation and they're in a healthy situation. And because this is going to take, and so let's take a look at the current situation.
Yeah.
I don't know about you all, but we are, we're trying to fill a whole bunch of open positions right now, and it's a tough labor market, and we're having to do lots of different things to address that. Our attention is 100% on that. Would this be a good time for us to get into a deep affiliation discussion? No. Now, we don't see this as being long term, but it's something to keep in mind. So you all, as you think about this, timing is everything. So you want to be in a situation where you're not distracted from a particularly big looming issue. If you've got a big looming issue, go ahead and address it, and then come to the table kind of unencumbered by that. And same thing with your partner. And that's why full disclosure is important. And look, I won't tell you that we've not gone through affiliations where there haven't been significant issues that the other parties disclosed to us, but that's okay. And it's all contextual, right? But yeah, timing is everything. And if you really look in the mirror and go, you're a troubled asset and you don't see a path out, then look for a company that is looking for those kinds of things. But know that when you enter a situation like that, those companies, their processes are, they do take control of everything, and you can understand why. That's not typically the way Centerstone operates, because again, we're not taking on troubled assets.
Right. Good, very good point. David, I just have to say, every single time you and I talk, whether it's on a webinar or just one-on-one, I always feel like I learned something. I certainly learned quite a bit today, and love your perspectives, love your humbleness in terms of what you've been able to achieve at Centerstone, and really proud of the work that you all do, and proud of both organizations as they went through this affiliation, because I think both organizations are stronger as a result. Any final comments?
Well, just first of all, thank you for all that, and I do hope and know that you know it's mutual feelings, Paul. It's been not only a great friendship, but really I've learned a lot from you, not just about this, about all kinds of things. And for those of you that maybe don't know Paul well, he can give you the 3,000 level course on managed care and so many other things, so technologies and so forth. So I've learned a lot from Paul, and really respect you and your expertise, and value your friendship very much. I appreciate y'all joining. Listen, I want to go back to, if you've got boards, you all have boards. If you're not yet in the process of an affiliation, look for every opportunity to expose them to webinars, conferences, books, whatever. Feed them as much of that as possible. It will pay dividends down the road. And if I can be of help to you, don't hesitate to reach out, david.guth@centerstone.org, and I'd be happy to be of help to you.
Great. Thanks again, David.
Well, and I'd like to thank both of you for bringing all of your expertise to the table, and thank all of you who are in attendance at today's web forum. As a reminder, this program will be available for you to share with your boards, and anyone else that you feel can be of influence as you're moving forward with this possible strategy. It'll be live tomorrow, as well as additional on-demand learning opportunities that Paul and David have also both been part of through our Open Minds platform. And you can join us again on Thursday, December 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for the next Circle Elite Executive Roundtable, capturing and managing the increasing volume and acuity of mental health referrals, which will feature Open Minds Senior Associate Aaron Pressel and Michael Stevens, who is the Director of Business Development at Lancaster Behavioral Health Hospital. Again, thank you all. Thank you, gentlemen, for presenting, and thank you all for attending. Have a fabulous day.